Hello and welcome to the show. I am so excited today to have Billie Oh on the show. And yeah, they are like a really, really awesome writer. I happened to come across an article in Huffington Post just a couple of weeks ago that came out, and it was all about their experience and journey fostering to adopt. And I just reached out on Substack. So I follow them on Substack, and I was just like, you know what? I'm just gonna reach out and like see if they would like to come and talk about their experience on the show. And sure enough, here they are. So yeah, welcome. I'm so happy that you're here.
Yeah, I'm so excited to be here. I was really excited to get your message, and you never know, like when you put something out into the world, where it will land or what other kind of like doorways or connections it might open to. And so it was really exciting to connect with someone who is also has a shared experience and
Yes.
have an opportunity to talk a little bit more in depth whenever you're writing something that's like, for a really broad audience of people, you have to keep things kind of to as simple and sort of linear as a
Right.
narrative as you can.
Right. Yeah.
And so obviously there's a lot more twists and turns and various other things that were not included in the Huffington Post
Sure.
piece
Right. Right.
because,
Exactly.
yeah.
That was
So
straight ahead, like, this is how it happened, and I appreciate that. I think it was great. It was super easy to read and, engaging, and so, yeah, I love that, but, I know you do a lot of creative writing too, and, let's start just at the beginning. So you're a new forever family, so you adopted Z. The finalization was pretty recent, like, within the last couple of months, is that correct?
yeah, super recent. Just at the very beginning of June.
Okay.
So yeah, coming up on like 2 months ish.
Congratulations. That's so
Thank
awesome.
you.
And how long had you, had, he Z? Is a
Yeah,
he, right?
yeah.
How
Yes.
long had
Yep.
he been in foster care? Like, how long had he been with you before that?
Yeah, so, almost 2 years. So he placed with me in August of 2021, and so we were coming up this August will have been, like, a full 2 years.
Okay. Okay, so that's pretty fast, actually. I mean, considering.
Yeah.
It
It didn't feel
and
super
no,
fast.
of course it didn't. I'm saying
But
that with, like, the privilege of hindsight of my experience because, yeah, one of ours took 2.5, and the other
mm,
one took, almost 2. And so, I know it's the waiting game is like it's a really challenging place to be. So I know you must feel really good having it like signed on the dotted line.
yeah, I feel like every step sort of for the last 6 months when we knew it was, you know, all things being what they are, like, very, very likely moving to
Uh-huh.
adoption, it was sort of every step that became a little bit more clear, a little bit closer to final. I think I gradually kept feeling a little bit more relief, and then once it was
Yeah.
actually like, "Nope, it's fully done, and you've signed papers, and you're getting documents in the mail," and things like that,
Right.
um, I think I didn't realize even how much more additional uncertainty and relief I would feel after that moment because I had
Uh-huh.
kind of you get your date and you're like, "Okay, we have the court date, blah, blah."
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, definitely, I think the uncertainty of everything before that.
Yeah. And how old is he?
Z is turning 4 in November.
Okay. So you brought him home. You welcomed him into the home when he was 2, around 2?
Yeah, he was about to
Okay.
turn 2.
Okay.
Mhm.
And, take me back a little bit in terms of your trajectory, deciding this. How did you decide to do this? How did you know you wanted to is it something that you always wanted to do? Or, tell me about that.
Yeah, so let's see. I had worked in childcare. My degree is in early childhood. I worked in childcare and then I worked in like family centered nonprofits as well. And so I always knew that I like wanted to be a parent and wanted to have kids in my life. And I don't think I was ever super tied to like how that was going to happen. Um, and like I previously, I did have a partner who we had, talked about, family building and things like that. And I had kind of always deferred to being like, "Yeah, I don't really know how that's gonna happen. I'm not really attached to how that's gonna happen, but
Mhm.
I would like to raise children at some point in my life. And, so I always just felt really open to it, and then when that relationship dissolved and I was sort of in this period of reworking where my career was at and I wasn't working directly with kids anymore, um, it just sort of hit me where, and this is in the article as well, but my mom and my aunt both went through foster care. And then my mom we had foster, she briefly was a foster parent when I was a kid. And
Mhm.
so, um, it's just a system. And then working in family services, we worked with social
Mhm.
workers, we worked with child protection as well in the nonprofit I was at. And so I just always been, I think, more aware of the system than a lot of people who aren't in direct contact with the foster system might be.
Sure.
So it
Right.
always kind of been in my peripheral vision of like, oh, that's
Right.
a thing I could do.
Right.
And then it just kind of clicked in this moment where, yeah, I had this flexibility in my career and I sort of had the stability. And I was like, well, I probably could do that if I wanted to. And so I just started like doing some like surface level research of like, oh, can single people even be foster parents? Like, what does that look like? What are the requirements?
Mhm.
And at every step, it was sort of like, oh, yeah, no, I do qualify. Like, yep, I do meet the basic requirements. And so then I kind of
Mhm.
just like kept going a little bit further. And I was like, well, I might as well fill out the application. I might as well do the next step. And I had actually previously, I kind of just remembered this, but in fall of 2020, I had actually already filled out an application and gone through like initial foster parent training in Hennepin County. And then I ended up moving to Ramsey County like later in that year in like early 2021. And so then, of course, you have to like resubmit everything when you move to a new county. And so
Right.
I just sort of fallen off and I just didn't, keep going with it. But then about a year later, um, I sort of picked it back up and I was like, oh, okay,
Uh-huh.
yeah, no, I think I am ready. I do want to go forward with it. So
Right. And was your intention to adopt, or were you just like, I'm gonna do foster care and I'm just gonna like care for a child
yeah,
and
no, definitely just foster care.
yeah.
And I was pretty clear about that, like, as well with my licensing. When I first had my first licensing visit, I was like, yeah, no, I'm not interested in adoption. I really
Mhm.
purely kind of just want to be a stand-in. Honestly, in retrospect, I mean, everything has worked out the way that it has. I think, you have to believe in a certain sense, like everything does kind of fall into place for some type of reason, which are reasons I don't know in this
Right.
moment, but,
Sure. Yeah.
um, in retrospect, and whenever I'm talking to prospective foster parents, I do put the caveat of, like, I think knowing what I know now, I would have been a lot more assertive in those initial meetings, and asked a lot more questions about types of foster care I could have been open to, because I was pretty clear that I was like, "Oh, I want under 2,
Mhm.
and I'm really only interested in foster, not in like a foster to adopt scenario." And I now knowing kind of what I know, I'm like, oh, I could have said like, oh, I'm only open for respite placements. I'm only open
Right.
for like transitional placements. And I think that would have aligned a lot more with like what I thought I wanted at the time, which was just this
Uh-huh.
very much like filling a gap, plugging a hole. I'm able to provide a safe place
Yep.
for short term.
Right.
Um,
Right.
And I didn't really realize at the time, like when I was checking the different boxes that I was open to, um, that I could like limit to only that. And then you're
Right.
really just solely in this corner of like short term here for, a couple days, maybe a couple weeks, that's it. Um, and kind of flowing through that. And I've met a couple other foster providers who are doing like strictly that,
Uh-huh.
um, or even like medical focused,
Mhm. Yeah.
anyway, and
Right.
that's,
Well, I think that's interesting because I think a lot of people don't know that that's even a thing, so it's worthwhile
y
to mention.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, 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 and I think so I didn't realize, yeah, I think I didn't quite realize that that was like a choice that you could be that clear and sort of like restricted about what you were interested in offering.
Sure.
And so then when I was advised of like, "Oh, well, maybe you want to be open to more things and sort of see how it goes and get a feel for it, I was just like, sure, yeah, that's fine too. Like and so you know, yeah, and then things go the way
Yeah.
they go. So like here we
Uh-huh.
are. But
Do you think they did
yeah,
that? First of all, were you working directly with the county or were you
hmm
working with an agency? You were
I
working
was with the
directly with the county.
county.
Okay.
Yeah.
And was that a decision that you made just sort of by default because that's all you knew? Or did you know that you could go through a foster agency and you made that
No.
choice or okay.
Yeah, I didn't even know foster agencies, and that actually so the couple of people who I met who were doing purely, like, very specific things, they were through
Mhm.
agencies.
Okay.
Um, no, yeah, so I didn't really know that. I only knew, um, that, like, the system is run through the county, and so that was
Right.
just sort of
So
my
you
point
just
of
went there
contact.
and yeah,
Mhm,
and I always say on this show, I just trying to for people who are trying to decide, you can do either. You can go straight through the county or you can go through a
mhm,
foster agency. It's been my experience and with the people I've talked to as well as myself that going through an agency can be it can provide a little more guidance and
mhm,
it can kind of there's somebody there for you in the scenario that you can ask questions to and that you can
mm.
that isn't like solely focused on what they're focused on but they're really focused more on you and what your experience is so it can be helpful to go through an agency I think. Did you experience any friction with the system itself, like was it what was the fostering process like for you?
Yeah. Well, first of all, just that makes a ton of sense, and
Mhm.
yeah, I didn't experience going through an agency, so I didn't know, but I would say that I think that there was I mean, it's just such a complicated, messy, um, system to be a part of, and I
Yeah.
think that I didn't realize quite at the outset, and who was I talking to? I think it was the guardian ad litem who was on our case, who really early into the placement had kind of advised me of like, "Yeah," and she was state appointed, she wasn't a volunteer guardian ad litem, but,
Okay.
that she was like, "Well, the reason for having kind of guardian ad litems on the case is just that we're really the only ones who are truly only looking out for best interest, and we don't really have any other incentives at play."
Mhm.
Um, and it was interesting because I just didn't really realize quite, I guess, like, how strongly, each different person's role and incentive, like, their job is to
Mhm.
try to get a certain outcome or to work toward a certain outcome. They have to, like, prove that and show that and demonstrate that in all these various different ways. Um, and how much of that has actually nothing to do with the child or what's going on, like, the close-up sphere, right? Like, everything's
Aha.
kind of up here,
Yes.
and very few people are actually, um, interested or have time, honestly, to pay
Right.
attention to, like, the that, like, close-up thing of, like, "Oh, how is this kid's regulation? What's going on here? What's going on there? How does the course of their day look? How do these different decisions that are being made interrupt or disrupt or benefit that,
Yeah.
process?" So,
Yeah. Yeah.
um
Well put.
and then even in
Yeah.
terms of how they're, communicating with you, what they're asking you to do, or various other things that, like, I guess I had sort of this naive perspective of that, like, everyone is still thinking of, like, the child and, like, the people in the relational system first and, like, working
Mhm.
well first, but there's just so many other factors at play a lot of the
Yeah.
time, that have,
Yeah.
like, nothing to do with that. So,
Right, right, right. Are you I want to dig in like a tiny bit deeper. Are you talking about specifically about the idea that it's about reunification no matter what? Like kind of a situation? Is that a piece of what you're talking about or
yeah. I mean, that's a piece of it. I think,
mhm.
um, also just, like, there were a lot of points at which it was just like, for example, like, transportation to visits. At the outset of our placement, I was transporting, like, to and from visits.
Mm.
Um, and it was pretty clear early on that that was, like, not going well, in terms of, like, contact. It was, like, hard for
With the
everybody.
biological parents?
Yeah, it was
Okay.
hard on her end, it was, like, hard on Z's end, it
Mhm.
was uncomfortable on my end, like, it wasn't really going very well for anyone, and I was, like, trying to tell different people about that, like, I was like, "Hey, this just doesn't seem like a great
Right.
thing. I think it's harder than it needs to be. Like, can we problem solve? Whatever, whatever." Um, and it was like, oh, well, like the county doesn't have a lot of, people available for transportation right now. So like, we're just kind of gonna, and it was like one of those things where I was like, oh, like if we want to build strong, because also the county puts a lot of emphasis on like wanting to have cooperation between first families and foster families and things like
Mhm.
that. And I was like, "Hey, if that's the goal, this is not helping. Like, this is actively making our
Yeah,
collaboration
right.
worse and putting us both in a situation where instead of being able to, like, slowly build trust and actually create, like, some type of co-parenting dialogue,
Right.
we're just having, like, all of this buildup of negative interactions and, like, conflict and emotional
Mhm.
disruption." And, like,
Mhm.
but there
Right.
you know what I mean? There just, like, wasn't even
Yeah.
a lot of room to, like, have that, um conversation with people.
Right.
I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I understand what you're saying. It's interesting, and it's so and then there's always the thing of, like, people sometimes people can get defensive, right? Because they're stuck working in a broken system, a
Mhm.
difficult system that and they have their job that they need to do, and there's so many jobs to do, like, they have so many
Yeah.
cases, and it's that I can see how if you start as an outsider coming in and saying, "I think it would be better if it was this way," I could
Mhm.
just see how the people would just be like, yeah, that's not how we do it because
Right.
of X, Y, and Z or whatever. And so, yeah, I get that. And that's an unfortunate, that's an unfortunate thing about being in any system in a way, right? Because like they have to
Mhm.
follow their protocol and it's a big, huge system
Yeah.
and it doesn't on an individual level oftentimes benefit the people who are involved. It's just like what they have to the protocol that they have to follow. So,
Mhm.
yeah, I found it very, um I had to be really, judicious in my I'd never tried to, like, step on toes, and I was very,
Mhm.
like, always sort of now it was a little different because I went into it really wanting to adopt. We were really
Mm.
wanting to adopt. So, it was a little different, but it was also like, yeah, just trying to, it's almost like when you go to the DMV or something and, like, you just
Mhm.
don't like, it's just like, do what they say and don't create, like, a thing because if you create a thing, then they will make your life, like, way harder. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like, it just the thing
Yeah.
becomes
You're walking this really careful balance, and it was interesting because a lot of times, like, feedback I'd get from my close circle was like, "Oh, you should ask about this, or you should push for this, or you should do these other right things," and I would take, like, 1 out of, like, 15 suggestions. I would
Mhm.
maybe very softly, lightly put out to someone to be like, "Hey, is it possible to maybe make this change?"
Right.
Because I think that yeah, I think everyone or many people who are in that, like, provider role,
Yeah.
you are just so thoroughly coached in training and everything that it's like, I am only responsible for, like, day to day. I don't have any say. It's not my job really even to advocate. It's my job maybe to give, like, advice on what's happening if there is an impact on what's happening, but,
Mhm.
like, I don't have anything else really, agency-wise, like, beyond that, that's in my
Right.
control.
Yes. Yep.
And I think, that yeah, so I think just, yeah, like, walking that line was definitely something that was, I was very aware of as for the
Right.
whole time that I was
Mhm.
in that position.
Right.
Mhm.
Let's talk about what it was like actually, logistically and also emotionally in every way to bring home all of a sudden you have a 2-year-old in your home. You're really young. I believe in the article you said you were 27 now, so you were 25,
Well,
right?
so I was 27. No, no, no. So I was 27 when he was placed with me.
Okay, my bad. Okay,
No,
so you're
yeah. It
27, but
was
that's still really young. Like, I at
yeah.
27, I was not ready to have, like, a child in my home at all. Um,
Mm.
so, yeah, let's talk about that. Everything from actually the space that you were living in, and how did you
Mm.
prepare that? And were you in like a small apartment, or how did that work to
Yeah.
bringing this baby, this toddler, which is a difficult age, by the way. So I want to talk about that too. And how
Mhm.
did you manage that?
Yeah, I don't know that I was ready, to be
Mm-hmm.
honest. Yeah, I mean, I definitely was underprepared likely, for what the reality of that was gonna look like.
Right.
I did have a couple days notice, so I was actually on a vacation with my mom and my brother, celebrating our birthdays when I got the call, and they
Mm-hmm.
were kinda like, "Hey, can you like, pick him up as soon as possible?" And I was like, "I'm not gonna be back in the state until, like, 2 days later, so can I come
Mm-hmm.
this weekend?" So I had, like, 48 hours, um, and so I just yeah, I ordered a bunch of stuff, like, off Amazon, like, I was like, "Okay, I know I need, like, diapers,
Yep.
I probably need,
Car
like,
seat.
blackout curtains." I had
Yeah.
these huge I was in a studio, like, essentially, it was a one-bedroom, but it was, like, open concept, there was no
Uh-huh.
doors or anything, and I had these
Okay.
really big windows that I just, like, was like, "Great, I have so much light." And I was like,
Right.
"Oh my god, this kid is gonna need to nap, like,
Yes.
I need to be blacked out," so I was trying to order, like, blackout blinds,
Uh-huh.
and, um, yeah, so I was just kind of frantically trying to think of what I might need and acquire those things
Right.
quickly, and
Yes.
then,
Yep.
um, I got some toys. I have nieces and nephews who are similarly aged. So my parents had some stuff like at their house, and I like
Mm-hmm.
took some of like their like bath toys and their other things back to my condo. And then I yeah, when I actually went to go pick him up, I mean, that was also it was a little bit odd too. I was surprised that they just like sent me he was in a kin placement at the time. And so they just like had sent me the address, sent me the info, and they were like, "Yep, you can just like go on Sunday." And I was like, "Cool." So I'm just
Just
like,
by
I just
yourself, like with
go yeah, I was like, "Do I need my ID? Like, is
Yeah,
anyone gonna
you're right,
like"
like, you're just picking up
seriously,
a
like, I was like, "So
baby.
I'm just gonna walk in and then take him with me, and that's cool? Like, we're all good with" so that was very odd, and I was like, "Okay, I guess that's how it works."
Like,
Um,
no social worker was there or anything? Like, there wasn't anyone
no,
like wow,
no social workers. It was on
interesting.
a weekend, so, like, she wasn't even working, so, like, she
Right,
wasn't even on her phone.
right.
Um So, yeah, I was just, like, texting with his grandma, and I was like, "Okay, like, I'm gonna come by," and so I drove over there. I was, like, pretty nervous. I walked in, she's like, "Okay, like, here's his backpack, here's him." She kinda gave me, like, a little rundown of some I don't even remember, like, some basic sort of, like, info on what he'd what he'd been doing.
Right, like
I got a lot of, 'cause, oh, no, I'm gonna be like, there was a lot of front loading of, like, the hardest things. He didn't
uh-huh.
speak, so he didn't have any
Okay,
words, and so
okay.
I got told that, like, a lot in the d
Mhm,
days leading up to this. They're like, "Yeah,
mm,
so, like, he's almost 2, he doesn't talk," you know?
mhm,
I was like,
mhm,
"Okay, cool,
mhm.
yep," and then, and she was like, uh, just sort of detailing various challenges that she had been having,
Uh-huh,
behaviorally, and I was
sure.
like, "Okay,"
Like, "Okay,
like,
got it." Yeah.
sounds good,
You're
um,
like, "Handled, alright, yeah,
yeah, I was
yeah,
just kinda trying to just be
okay."
like, "Yeah, yeah, 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 yeah," and then I went out and, like, got his car seat. They had a car seat for him, and they had, like, a stroller and stuff, and I threw that in my car, and then I just was like, "All right, well, like, bye."
Wow.
Um,
And how was he? Like, how was he responding to going with a stranger that he didn't know and
yeah, he was interesting. His first reaction when I walked in, which was, like, a pretty typical first reaction for him, just, like, across the board, is I, like, knelt down, and he just immediately was like, "Bam!" And I was like, "Cool. Great
what, like,
start."
hit you?
Just, like, I mean, yeah, hit, just kinda, like, swatted, like,
Uh-huh.
swatted in my direction. I was
Right.
like, "Okay, cool." Um, and then he but by the time I was there maybe for 10 minutes, honestly, it was very short.
Yeah.
But by the time that I was, like, getting ready to actually go get in my car, I was like, "Okay, Z, like, let's go. And I just kind of like put my arms out and he just like hopped into my arms and we
Aw.
walked out to my car together.
Mhm.
Um, yeah. And so then I was like, I mean, I was pretty overwhelmed. Like I think my whole body, like I was like, having like a kind of like a shaking type of reaction. Like I was a little bit dissociated, but I was also like definitely like, whoa, what is going on?
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
and so then I drove to my mom's house
Mhm.
because I was like, I don't even know where to go. Like, I don't know
Right.
what we're
Like what
doing for the rest of the day. It was like noon. It was
yeah.
like the afternoon. And so I was like, I don't even know what the plan is. And so I was like,
Right.
okay, we're gonna go to her house. Um, he played for a little bit. He immediately like fell asleep, I think for like an hour.
Mhm.
And then we went yeah, then when he woke up, we like went to pick up a Target order. I had like placed this Target order. Um, so we picked that up on our way home and then like drove back to my apartment and this was like my first realization where I was like, oh, it's gonna be really hard to like get in and out of my building because I lived in this, big,
Mm.
a condo building. And I
Mhm.
parked my car and then I was like, well, how do I get like him and all of the stuff
Mhm.
like into my building?
Right. Yeah.
And so then we had this cart, so I tried to like load up the cart and then kind of was like carrying him. He didn't really like to be carried at the time. So he
Mhm.
kept trying to walk and then run,
Yeah. Oh
away.
god.
And then I was like,
Totally, like,
okay, so I'm just
that
trying to like grab
age.
him, like push the
Yep.
thing, get us all into the building, like navigate the different door entry swab, like key things, um, get into the elevator. At one point he was like on all of the pile of stuff and I'm like pushing him on the cart to like get into the elevator.
Uh-huh.
Eventually there were so many doors in that building. It was like so many doors to try and get through. But yeah, eventually we did make it, into the apartment and
Yeah.
then kind of put some of the stuff away. I think he was, doing his thing. We went to the park,
Mhm.
played at the park for a while and then yeah, we like went home. I didn't have daycare for the first week that he
Mhm.
was with me because
Mhm.
everywhere was like wait lists and we had to
Right.
do registration and all of that. And so
Yep.
I was like quasi trying to work from home, like
Mhm.
also with him. And that was a disaster when
Disaster.
it was
Yeah,
not
that
going well at
doesn't
all.
mm-mm. Mm-mm.
Um, I have a very kind boss, but I was sending like totally nonsensical emails, like wrong times, bad, like
Yeah.
so many things were just like incorrect. And she was like, hey, are you okay? Are you like, she knew what was going on, a little
Right.
bit, but she
Yeah,
was also
yeah,
like, are
yeah.
you doing okay? Like, how are you? And
Right.
I was like,
Yeah.
I don't know. But
Yep. Yep, yep, yep. And
yeah,
yeah, and you can't get any kind of, like, leave or anything like that, obviously, when you're doing that. Once
yeah.
you finalize the adoption, I don't know if you have this kind of a job. I don't, but
Mm.
my husband did. Once we finalized the adoption, he was able to actually take a small,
Like
paternity
a
leave,
paternal leave.
which
Yeah.
was awesome, but I mean, it could have really helped, like, at the
At the front
beginning,
end.
not
I
2.5
know.
years later, but, whatever.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
do like only pretty much independent contracting. So I don't really have any.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
Um, but
Yeah.
yeah, so that was kind of that initial thing, and then he did get into daycare,
Mhm.
which was great. We started building up that routine, and it was just like a million different like screenings and doctor's appointments,
Yeah.
and yeah, a lot of people just like visiting my home.
Sure. Yeah, I know. And that I was just talking to somebody else about this, that was unexpected for me too. Like, I didn't really realize the
Mm,
extent of the appointments
so
beforehand.
many.
Like, oh my
Yeah,
god. And I would often think, like, how would you do this if you had, like, a regular job?
normal job.
Because my husband has a regular job, so he was always at work, and I was doing all of
Mhm.
the stuff because I'm a freelancer. And I thought, God, if I was doing this alone, or if I was a single parent who had like a regular job, like, oh man,
Yeah.
how do you even do it?
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of like yeah, it was a lot of juggling, schedule-wise. I was constantly trying to get people like I was like the earliest possible time they could come to my house. I was like, "Come to my house at
Mm.
7 AM."
Hmm. Hmm.
Like, "Come to
Hmm.
my house as early as you can so that we can do the half an hour visit,
Yep.
get whatever out of the way, and then I can still get him to daycare maybe by like 8:30 and have like a
Right.
relatively full workday."
Yep.
Um,
Yep.
yeah.
How long did it take him to and this is a layered question, I'm sure, but, like, how long did it take him to acclimate to being with you, and then,
Mhm.
like, for that relationship to deepen and all of that stuff? Because, like, with both of my children, they were, newborns when I
Mm.
brought them in, and I'm just wondering, like, having a toddler and bringing a toddler in, how long does that take, and what were the challenges?
Yeah. Um, let's see. I mean, I think it's been, like, layered, right? I think
Mhm,
it's every and I even, like, now will notice when we move into kind of, like, a new phase attachment-wise, and I'll be like, "Oh, like, that's different,
mhm,
than it used to be," and I think I've never had any other kids, so I
mhm,
haven't ever, like, experienced, like, attachment or bonding in a different way, but I have, like,
mhm.
worked with kids and studied
Right.
child development, so I have, like, some kind of basis of that, um, but I think, you know, I don't timeline is tricky. I would say the things
Mhm,
that I noticed were, like, if we were at a park, um, and I would notice that he was, like, much more actively, like, tracking, and I would say, like, a lot of people who are coming into our home would notice, like, by the time we were, like, a few months in, all of his, he was getting screened for, like, early intervention and things like that, and
mhm,
the providers would note, um, how, like, actively he was tracking, like, my voice and, like, what I was
mhm.
saying and, like,
Yep,
things like that, and so,
yep.
like, early stages of attachment, I think, were pretty quickly
Okay.
forming,
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
um, and, and then it just kind of, like, kept building on that. The hard part, obviously, is if, since he was a toddler and he did have pretty, like, big disruptions in his attachment formation in, like, the first 2 years of his life,
Mhm,
that, even as he was building a little bit of that security, it's and also, like, I mean, even still to this day, like, it's still very much like s there's, like, the under right under the surface of, like, insecurity as well,
mhm.
and so, like, even
Yep.
around our house, like, now, right, and he's gonna be 4 soon, but it's like if we're, like, playing together in his room and I leave, and then I'm in the kitchen or something, I mean, for the longest time, he would just, like, scream and be like,
Mhm.
"Bee!" Like,
Mhm,
when he
mhm,
noticed that
mhm.
I'm gone,
Yeah.
um, and that's less it's like the volume has turned down a little bit on that,
Uh-huh. Yep. Yep,
now, where it's
yep.
like, oh, sometimes he might just be like, "Try and come find me," or "Look around
Mhm.
the house for me," or whatever. Um, but, there's definitely that undercurrent of, like, insecurity and of
Yeah.
a little bit of that need to, like, triple check that I'm,
Sure.
there and things
Yep.
like that. But, yeah, I would say within, like, the first few weeks to month, it was definitely like he knew that it's like, "Okay, this is my person
Mhm.
who's,
Mhm.
around."
Yep.
Um And then, every kind of, like, continued as long as things, like, kept going and kept getting more stable and it kept
Mhm.
being a longer amount of time, then that kind of just, like, kept building and building.
Yep. Yeah, that makes sense. And for you, did do any of your other friends have children or anything like that? Or did you just suddenly, like, all of a sudden you have a toddler and, what was that like? And did you have help from your friends or, were they involved, you know?
Yeah. I had so I had one friend, who did have a little bit of an older kid who had, like, a 4-year-old at the time, so there's, like, a 2-year age gap. But
Mhm.
really only one friend, of, like, my before Z friends
Yeah.
that had kids.
Mhm.
Um, and then everybody else, yeah, no, and it was I mean, for the first year, essentially, like, really the only people I was hanging out with were, like, my parents,
Mhm.
like, my mom and stepdad who are local, and, like, that one friend who, like, did
Yeah.
have a kid. That was pretty
Yeah.
much it, like, that was kind of my whole social life. I didn't really see, um and I would have other friends who would kind of cycle in and out, like, hang out with us sometimes or do things like that, but I couldn't really leave Z with babysitters because, like, I maybe had a babysitter other than my mom and stepdad, like, a couple times in the
Mhm.
first year just because it
Mhm.
wasn't, um it just wasn't really tenable. And then that
Right.
one, the friend of mine that did have a kid, we would like we would like kind of like co-babysit and like
Right.
swap things, you know, with
Yeah.
each other.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, but other than that, not really. And so I
Yeah.
think that was a I didn't realize, again, I mean, I didn't realize many things, but like one of the things I didn't realize was like how socially isolating it would be to have a toddler. And I think even compared to a newborn, like newborns, you kind of get this grace period of like 3 to 6 months where they can kind of just like tag along with you wherever you're going and they
Yep.
sleep a lot. So
Yep.
like they're just kind of asleep,
Totally.
you
Yep.
know? But
100%.
toddlers are super not, and they will just, I mean, we would go like I think maybe twice we tried to go to someone's house and it's like he would just, you know, destroy
Destroy the
whatever
house.
thing
Yeah,
was
totally.
there. And then it's like, okay,
Yeah.
we're gonna leave now, like
Yep.
15 minutes in. Um,
Yep.
so yeah, I don't think I quite realized like how restrictive it would be to structure my whole life around like only the things that we could do safely and stay regulated.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a really, really big deal. Like a really it's a very life-changing, obviously, thing. And yeah, I just yeah, I have so much respect for you for doing this and at such a young age. And yeah, I can't imagine having done that at your age. Like I was like barely taking care of myself at the time, you know? So
Oh,
it's
and
like,
yeah, I mean,
oh my God.
I didn't really have it super together. I like again, I was kind of joking. I was like, I sort of learned like, I feel like, there was like, steps along the way, but it was sort of like learning how to be a grown up via this, like, sort of, like, trial by fire thing
Mhm.
where it was like, "Oh,
Mhm.
I have to do laundry in a normal way. I can't wait, like, 3 weeks to do my laundry
Right.
because it is literally not possible, so I have to just learn how to do this." And now, like, 2 years in, I'm like, I have it's pretty good. Like,
Yeah,
laundry
totally.
doesn't stress me out anymore. For the first, like, 6 months, it was horrible. I was like, "I
Yeah.
have no idea how anyone manages this.
Oh my
Like, this is
God.
ridiculous. How do you wash this much laundry all the
Yep.
time? Like, this is how what are you doing?" I just have piles everywhere.
I am
Um,
still like that. Like I
it's
I
just
I
like
have a 3-year-old and an 8-year-old, and I can't with the laundry. It's like I just cannot with the laundry. It's
it's
the
a
bane of my
lot.
existence. It's
It's
so much.
so much, and it was like this yeah, so like, grocery shopping similarly, I don't
Yes.
cook, so, like, that wasn't an issue, but even just getting the groceries
Yeah.
and knowing what to buy and, like, preempting
Yep.
what I should be buying and how much, and, like, all of that, that took, again, like, I would say probably, like, a year before I was like, "Oh, I just can kind of remember the things,
Right.
and then I know, like, we need more
You
apples,
have
or
to
we need
have
more
certain
this,
things.
we
Yep.
have to have these base things kind of all
Yep.
the time, and, like, if I just buy them before it's gone, then it's less of a crisis," and it's
Right.
like,
Yep.
um, that type of skill
Yeah.
building, something I didn't ever have to the thing is, like, when I was just myself, like, I didn't have to learn those skills. I could have learned them. It would have made my transition into parenthood easier if I had learned them before I had the kid present,
Yeah.
but, like, post having the child in your home, then it's like, "Oh, it's not a choice anymore." Like, I just have
You
to
have to do it.
do this to make my life function. Whereas if it's just me, then it's like I could do whatever I want. I could wait 3 months to do my laundry because ultimately, like, it's just me. It doesn't really
Right.
matter. But then it's like, so it
Yeah.
really forced the issue on a lot of those more just, like, basic life skills.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And so now as a parent, when you are I don't know if you're dating now or whatever, and that's like personal and none of my business, but I'm just curious, but I'll ask anyway, and you can tell me no if you don't want to talk
Mhm,
about it.
mhm.
Um, I'm just curious about like, so is it this thing now where like you have to be like you have to say, well, I have a child, and like so, and do you look for people who also have children or who don't have children,
Mhm.
or how what is that like for you?
So funny. Yeah.
Or do you
Um,
just not want to talk about it?
no, 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 we can
Okay.
totally talk about it. So I didn't date, like, at all for, like, a year and a half,
Mhm.
essentially, just because I was well, again, the whole babysitter thing,
Right.
and just in general, I was, like, just to keep all of our heads above water. Like,
Mhm.
there was just simply not any time or brain space to try and date, and so, um, yeah, but then it was about, like, a year and a half in, and that was also when things were kind of, like, leaning towards permanency in a much more clear way than they had been previously, and I was like, "Oh,
Mhm.
man, like, if I'm ever gonna date again, I do have to figure this out." Like, like, I
Mhm.
was like, "Oh, so if this is gonna be, like, a forever situation, um, I guess I need to figure out how to date as a parent,"
Mhm.
because
Mhm.
um, I hadn't really put any effort or thought into logistically trying to figure out how people do that. And
Right.
so then I
Yeah.
was like, "Okay, I'm gonna, like, try and figure this out," and immediately the first thing is, like, and I've spent my whole life, like, my whole dating life essentially on dating apps because I
Mhm.
that was just yeah,
You're that age. Yeah.
that is the
I
age
I
that I
missed
am, so
I
yeah.
missed all that, but yeah, I know that's, like, how people meet people. Yep.
Yeah, so I've been on
Mhm.
da I mean, I've been on them for, like, more than a decade at least, and so I'm, like, very familiar with kind of, like, the, dating app game world,
Right.
whatever, like, how to do
Yep.
it, and,
Yep.
um, but it was hilarious because literally within, like, the first, couple days of just casually, like, looking at dating apps, I was like, "Whoa, the number of people that explicitly have, like, don't want kids in their profile is, like,
Mm.
staggering." Like, there's so
Wow.
many people, especially if your age range is, like, I'm about to be 29, but yeah, so if you have your age range, like, 27 to 35 or something like that,
Right.
um, so many, so many, and I was, like,
Wow.
having a crisis. I was talking to one of my friends. I was like, "What is happening? What is going on?" Because, like, do I just have to swipe no on every single person who has, like, doesn't want kid in their bio? Because, like,
Wow.
why would I even talk to them? You know what I mean? Like, I'm just,
Right.
like, limiting myself out. Um, but, it's a little bit, I would say now, whatever, it's been, like, 6-ish months since I've
Yeah.
been like, "Okay, I should figure out this whole dating situation," and it's interesting because I mean, like, I'm also queer, and so queer dating has its own world of, like, poly and ethical non-monogamous and people with partners who are married who also are dating, and so it's like there's a
Uh-huh.
lot of different ways that you can kind of choose to engage with that or, like, make up your little I don't know, make up your life, and
Right.
um so yeah, I think that it's, like, in terms of, like, oh, like, would you look for someone who, like, has kids or someone who's, like, wanting to have kids or whatever I think I'm still sort of in the process of sorting out of, like, oh, does that look like having, like, could that look like having, like, casual connections with people who, like, it really doesn't matter if they want to parent or have kids, and that can just stay really separate, right? And
Right.
that can just be my thing that I do in my life, and
Right.
I see them, every month or every 3 weeks or something, and it's just a very low commitment kind of, like, thing,
Yeah. Yeah. That
or
makes
does it look
sense.
like specifically looking for people who, like, do want to parent and, like, do want to have kids and then trying to
Right.
figure out, like, okay, like, how do you integrate that? What does that look like? I
Right.
have been, for the most part, not super interested in trying to build connections with people who have their own kids,
Mhm.
um, just because, like, just a whole other then that's just its whole own other thing
Mhm.
to think about. It's not that I would necessarily be, like, unwilling ever, but I feel like I grew up in a my parents are divorced, and I grew up in blended families on both sides of their
Mhm.
houses, like, with step siblings and bio siblings and things like that, and it is an undertaking,
Mhm.
to, like,
Mhm.
blend that, and if there's a different co-parent involved, then you've got, like, a whole 'nother dynamic that you're
Mhm.
navigating with too, and so there's just, like, a lot there. So I feel like I have, like, a lot of hesitancy around, um it's not necessarily like it would be like a no never, but I think I would have a lot of questions at the outset of, like, how that was gonna look and how
Yeah.
that would function. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. And also I'm sure that you probably feel since Z has experienced loss in his life and
Mm.
you don't want to just like you probably want to really make sure that before you introduce him to somebody or whatever, and
Mhm.
then let alone a whole family with other siblings and all this,
Yeah.
it's like just make sure that this is going to be a thing, because it's hard to, you don't want to subject not only yourself to that potential loss, but your
Mhm.
child. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, I like to think that, I have, like, so I was married previously, and I have, like, my ex we're still really close. We're really good friends. We've, like, stayed on good terms,
Mm-hmm.
and so, like, he's around, and he's like to Z, he's like an uncle at
Oh,
this
that's
point,
nice. Yeah, that's
essentially.
good. Yeah.
Yeah, he's like in the uncle category, um, and that's been really sweet and really nice. And I have like I feel like in the best of circumstances, just to speak into like the abandonment thing and like the
Yeah.
fear of like, oh no, it's another loss, it's another hurt and things like that.
Aha.
Um, I would have a hope that like for the most part, anyone, like if I do end up, in a relationship or with someone that it's like there wouldn't be this like devastating blow of like, and then they're like gone from your life forever, or
Right.
something like that. I think, there's a lot of things you can't control for, but for the most part, it's like if people are in and out of that like adult ecosystem,
Mm-hmm.
as long as everything before that level of like, oh, we're like living together and we're like using, you know what I mean? Like then I think
Yeah.
that's like it becomes a little bit different. But everything before that, it's like if there's like close friends of mine who are like in and out of our lives and other people who are
Right.
in and out of our lives, that all feels very like manageable and doable and doesn't feel like a super like it needs to be like a super big thing that's like in a different category, I guess, to like everybody
Yeah.
else. If that makes sense.
It totally does. Yeah,
Yeah.
that makes perfect sense. Yeah. And in terms of his speech and his speaking and special needs and stuff, did
Mm.
what happened with that? So he wasn't speaking when you first brought him home, and then did, did it take a long time? Did I'm assuming he's speaking now because you said he calls your name.
Yes. Yes,
So
he has many, many words.
yeah.
No, he is speaking. We were referred to, so we had early intervention come
Mm-hmm.
out and they did a screening and he failed his hearing test. And they were like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, that can just happen. They're really wiggly, like whatever, whatever. We'll do it again. So they came back
Mm-hmm.
out. He failed again. And they were like, okay, well, at that point, we like have to refer you to an ENT. And they even at that point, they were like, it seems like he can hear, but
Right.
you should just go get this checked out. And
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
we went to the ENT, and they were like, "Oh no, he has, fluid buildup and he's like 80% deaf." And I was like, "Oh,
Wow.
well, great. That would impact your ability to learn how to speak."
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so they recommended ear tubes.
Okay.
And then he had ear tube surgery maybe like 9 months into placement with me.
Mm-hmm.
And pretty immediately, like huge growth in terms of
Wow.
language. Yeah, so then by the time probably within like he was still a little bit behind speech-wise,
Mhm.
um, for maybe another like 4 or 5 months after the ear surgery, but then after that has just been pretty much like 100% average in terms of,
Wow.
speech development and stuff like that. Yeah.
Wow, that's
He
amazing.
also ended up getting, he had 2 surgeries in the first year that he was with me. He also ended up getting his tonsils and adenoids removed, because he
Okay.
had a lot of, like, breathing stuff and sleep
Uh-huh.
disruption from it,
Mhm.
so yeah.
Yeah, yeah, it's amazing to me how, like, that may have gone completely undiagnosed and undealt with for who if you weren't in the
Yeah.
picture. I mean, it's just yeah,
Yeah,
it's
I love early intervention.
yeah, me
I'm
too.
very, very pro screening. I think it
Yep.
is good, and I also, um really for anyone in like a foster scenario, I do think that like trying to, there's a lot of like there can be like mixed in hesitations around like labels and getting services and things like that. But I am very much in the category of people who's like just get the label and try and get
Oh,
as many
me
services
too.
as you possibly can,
Yeah, get the
and qualify
diagnosis.
for as many
Yep.
things as you possibly can. Because and it's like even at this point, like he has a PTSD diagnosis, and so therefore also qualifies for like therapy services, special ed
Mhm.
services, things like that. Um, and it gives us a lot more flexibility in terms of working with his daycare providers on behaviors,
Right.
theoretically down the road, working with the school district and accommodations and things like that. And it's just like I I never see any downsides.
I
So
I'm so glad you said that because I feel like some people are really afraid of the diagnosis. My
mhm,
my daughter is autistic, and she was diagnosed early. She was diagnosed at about 4, and I'm
mhm,
so grateful for that. Like so grateful, so that like we could begin helping her and educating ourselves, and
mhm,
from like early on. And I know a lot of families um where I'm kind of like, I'm pretty sure that kid's on the spectrum. Like, it's not my place to say,
mhm,
but like, and I think they just don't want to, it's like that diagnosis, autism, as if it's a bad
mhm.
word. Um, and it's not, and it's just a brain difference. And, things are changing, hopefully, out there in the world. I follow a lot of autistic adults. And so I'm really in that conversation and committed to like a new way of thinking about it. But I completely agree with you. It's like, get the diagnosis, get the services, get the accommodations.
Mhm.
There is no downside to that. And they used to
Yeah.
say, oh, well, you don't want to be a diagnosis, you don't want that following you around for the like that. I remember people saying that when I was younger, like,
Mm.
you don't want that following around for the rest of your life or whatever. And it's like,
Mhm.
yeah, no, it's actually, it can be a really good helpful thing. And the person is more than their diagnosis, of course, but like,
Yeah.
yeah. So,
Well, and especially with, early like, on the early, like, the 0 to 5
mhm,
range, it's just, like, the research is also so incredibly clear that the earlier you can provide supports and services, you have, like, such a much better chance of being able to be in less restrictive environments later, being able to be more successful in any variety of scenarios you might end up in. And so
right.
it's just it's always like it's just like such a hard like thing where I see people where I'm like, oh, if you had just like gone with the referral the first time you got it,
Yeah.
um, you might have avoided like a lot more hard things down the road. And
Yeah.
um yeah, and also I mean it's a bummer too because it's a lot of times it's also just lack of knowing what like all the amazing resources you do get access to if you go down
Right.
that road, and how beneficial that is. I mean, I'm also in the camp of being like, I think that like for the most part, like early intervention, these like, family service plans and things like that, a lot of times are helpful for like all kids. It's really just having a
Yes.
professional who's
Yep.
watching your kid very closely and tracking their development and helping you brainstorm ways that you might help them like be more
Yes.
successful and
Agreed.
keep working towards the developmental goals.
Yep.
Every single kid could benefit from that,
Yep.
but it's like these, particularly like in particular kids who are like vulnerable or who have had trauma or who have had, exposure to drugs prenatally or things
Mhm.
like that. It's like
Mhm.
it only is gonna help. It's only gonna help offset some of those things that you might see coming up as like developmental disruptions later.
Right.
Um, and
Totally
so it's
agree.
like, yeah, it's just this thing where it's not a yeah, I mean, most early ed services really are like 90% play. It's like
Yeah.
you're just kinda
Yeah.
like playing with
Totally.
toys, but you're talking to people about what's going on and,
Right.
um, yeah.
Right. And you have those other
So,
eyes to,
yeah.
just to you have other eyes, just
And to be
people.
a resource and support for you, too, which is
Yep.
I feel like such a huge thing, especially if you do have a kid who has more challenging behaviors or who has developmental differences. You just have, like, another grown up who's also present to be like, "Yeah, I see that too, and here are some things you might wanna think
Right.
about," or, "Here's other families I've worked with have done," and you just get, like, some of that perspective in real time.
Yeah. Yeah. Agreed. Agreed. And are you the same race as Z? Is it a transracial
No.
adoption or no?
No, it is a
Okay.
transracial adoption.
Okay, because
Yes.
I have, we're a transracial family as well, so just, always like to bring that up and talk about that because I think it's important. I
Mhm.
think it's just an important thing that, like, years ago, people didn't really think about that, like, it was kind of just like, "Oh, whatever," and we can just bring this child up exactly like we would any other
Mhm.
child. And yes, you can, but also I feel like there's a responsibility there. I'll talk about just for myself. So my son is
Mhm.
black, and it's like, we were in a in a school when we moved to New York from LA last summer, and we were in a school this past year that was a really nice school, like a really, really beautiful school, but not very diverse, and like none of the teachers were of color. And
Mm.
we've pulled him out, and we're going to be sending him to a different school this coming year because it just didn't feel, it's like I don't feel comfortable with this. I feel like he needs role
Mhm.
models that look like him, and so we're much happier now where we're decided to go because it's like most of the teachers are African American, and the student body is very, very mixed. And so, anyway, I'm just wondering if that's in the equation for you.
Yeah, definitely. Um, yeah, I think about it, I feel like on a few different levels, for sure, and it's definitely something I thought about a lot less so when I was in the foster role solely, just because that is,
Hmm. Right.
it's something you can think about on the day to day, and I think even just moving. I've talked actually to Z's therapist about this a lot because we get therapy services too. But
Hmm.
anyway, um, but I was talking with her about it because I think even moving through the world, um, with like if you're in a mixed race family, um, you feel to be perceived really differently than I think if you are
Hmm.
like a same race family. And it's something that I've just been I pretty immediately as soon as he was placed with me that I was aware of like moving through the world of just noticing how people like observe you and look at you,
Hmm.
and you can just kind of like feel the question marks of people trying to put together like
Right.
why and how
Hmm.
you are connected, in a way that,
Hmm.
like, they don't, like, right? Like, when I would move through the world with, like, my niece and nephew who are, also both white, and we would just be at the park or we'd be doing whatever together, like, I never felt, like, observed in this way of people
Uh-huh.
trying to, like, figure out why I was with this child or how this child was related to me or who else was in the picture or wasn't in the picture or, like,
Hmm.
whatever, and it would be weird too because if I was out with friends, or, like, a friend who could theoretically have been, like, a co-parent, you would also feel the shift of how people are like, just very odd. It's just like a much
Right.
more like viscerally felt thing that I had ever been used to,
Right.
which was illuminating, honestly, in terms of like living, in the society that we do and living like under this very, um, in the systems that we do and like inside of white supremacy, essentially, and of just being
Yeah.
like, oh, as a white person, having moved through my whole life up until that point and not really having any perspective or feeling of, like, just how visible and how, like, differently observed you are if you're moving through our same society as a person of color, and I think even just
Mm.
having a child who's with you who isn't white,
Mhm.
feeling a little bit of that just being perceived so much more,
Yeah.
people watching you, people, like, try again, like, it was just, like, this very different
Mhm.
feeling that I'd ever had, and I've nannied a bunch, I've been in the world with kids a bunch, and so it's just like I
Yeah.
didn't, it took a minute to, like, place it and then be like, "Oh, that's different." But yeah, so I think I was aware of it obviously from the start, and even with
Right.
Z's, like, with his mom, we had pretty direct and transparent conversations about, she's Black. Z is biracial, but,
Mhm.
she's the parent who I have the most and we still have, we have contact now too as
Mhm.
well, um but yeah, we had direct conversations about it as well and her attachment to various, um, ways that she wants him to be connected to like his identity and his culture. And so like that was kind of has always been a part of the conversation.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, I think about it in terms of like my social circle and places that we like spaces in different ways, things that we occupy together. I also think about it in terms of his, school environments, obviously, like you spoke to. Um, it is yeah, there's like it is frustrating, um, at times to feel like there's like especially I'm in Minneapolis,
Mhm.
we have a really segregated public schooling system,
Mhm.
and a lot of times, like, as these things go, right, like, there's also, like, a pretty stark difference in terms of, like, school performance versus
Yeah.
schools that are, like, predominantly white versus more diverse schools,
Yes.
um that's, like, a pretty brutal choice to try and face to be like, "Oh, I want you to be in a school that is, like, representative and reflective of you," I also want you to be able to, like, be successful,
Right.
in school
I
and
know.
have the
I
supports
know.
that you need and have
Mhm.
resources that you need, and especially if you have kids, who, like I don't know if, autism is at play with your son you were talking about, but if you have any learning differences or things
Mhm.
like that of being like,
Mhm.
"Oh, um, that just adds a whole 'nother layer, right? Of,
It
like, not
does.
trusting necessarily that that system is going to help you be successful. I also think, like, trying to be the parent to, um, like, specifically Black boys in the society
Mhm.
is, like, knowing how the school system often responds and treats
Yeah.
behaviors, same behaviors that are happening
Yep.
between, different kids and then kids who are Black boys and being like, "Oh, that's" yeah. So, anyway, so I think that, it's a lot of things to try to work through, and for the most part, luckily, we're not in elementary yet. Right now, he's still in daycare,
Right.
and so, like, at this point, like, I'm feeling like that's once we get to elementary, it'll just be kind of, like you said, it's like having to assess and then make those calls
Mhm.
and then see how it goes and then assess again
Right.
and then kinda, like, keep adjusting.
Right.
Um, yeah, but I
Yeah, thanks for just speaking to that because it's not an easy thing to even talk about, and it is so true about, like, what you were saying just about, do I give this kid, like, I want him to go to the best school, but what is the best for him? Like,
Mhm.
what does that actually mean? What is more important and what is equally as important? Like, it's a lot. Yeah, it's a
Yeah.
lot.
Yeah, and
But
of wanting him to be able to, because Z, for example, like, he just has a lot of, like, emotional regulation stuff and behavior
mhm,
things, and you can observe how different environments trigger different things.
sure.
Um,
Yeah.
and of knowing, and I've talked to, like, various different of his providers of being like, he can be very, very successful and on task and can perform, like, pay a ton of attention, be really focused, do all of these things, like, that's definitely accessible to him, or it can be, like, absolute sort of, like, chaos
Uh-huh.
and in terms of behaviors, and knowing just, like, from an education perspective and everything else of, like, how pivotal the environment is
Mhm.
to either one of those things happening,
Yeah.
and so then having to, like, try and account for that in the way that you're evaluating schools as well, and it being like, is this and yeah, anyway.
And that's a good point too, and that's really valid too because, I mean, that's a baseline thing of, like, for instance, with my daughter, like she has to be in a
Mhm.
smaller environment. She just cannot go to a public school, like a big public school.
Right.
It's too much for her. It's too chaotic.
And
It's too,
yeah,
she doesn't do well in that environment, She
yeah.
really doesn't. And
And
so, and
then
go ahead.
oh, no, I was just gonna say, I think that's really like, that's just such a helpful perspective, and I think that's where a lot of times, I mean, with every parenting decision, but just like, it when you are weighing these different things that do all matter, but it also has to be under the lens of, like, who is this specific kid also,
Yep.
right? And, like, yes, Z's race is a part of his identity. He also has a variety of other things that are, like, also important to take into consideration when
Right.
choosing what type of school environment is gonna be best suited for him, and it's, like, that definition of best, right? And it's, like, if being able to, actually be emotionally regulated enough to learn
Mhm.
is like a baseline thing, right? And
Right.
if for your daughter where you're like, no, it has to be a smaller environment. It has to be
Yep.
controlled in these specific ways just so she's even able to, like, be in a brain mode that
Yeah.
allows her to learn.
Yep.
And so you just have to account for so many different perspectives and layers to what
Yeah.
that decision looks like.
Yep. So true. It's been so awesome talking to you. I feel like I could just go on and on, but I want to be mindful of the time. So if you do you have any words of advice or anything for anyone who might be considering this road of fostering or fostering to adopt
Mm.
that you want to say before we say goodbye?
Yes, sure, I do.
Okay.
Um, yeah, I think well, I mean, like, when I was like, I definitely was underprepared and I wasn't super ready. I think everyone always is gonna be underprepared and not super ready for what this road looks like.
Mhm.
Um, but I do think that it is, like, genuinely I mean, I across the board just kind of, like, believe in doing hard things. I think it helps us to just learn how to be, like, better, more compassionate humans to everybody else in our lives, and so it's, like, inevitably, um, will be a very hard road, I think, for anyone who does choose to jump into it,
Yep.
but I think there's so much learning along the way ultimately, and I think the main thing, that I just generally it's like my wish for the whole for the whole, like, foster, um, community, but, like, also, like, foster adoption, all of that, also just for parents in general, I guess, but specifically that because it's such its own little thing is,
Sure.
um, I do wish there was more community, and I feel like things like this are helpful to that.
Me too.
Even
Yep.
people who are, like, not in your state, like, I had, like, one person who I knew I had, taught her daughter in preschool, and so I knew that she had adopted her daughter out of foster care, and I, like whatever, I had her phone number, I, like, reached out to someone, I was like, "Hey, do you have their phone number? Like, can I" and we maybe talked on the phone, like, not super frequently, right? Like, maybe 4 or 5 times throughout the whole process,
Mhm.
um, but it was so incredibly necessary to just have,
Yeah.
like, that one person I could call and unload what was happening on and
Yep.
have it be someone who wasn't in my immediate family, someone who, like, wasn't involved in the system or the case, didn't really it was just, like, a person who could get all of the details, who had been through something similar, and who
Mhm.
could at least just, like, hear where I was at. Um, and I think even more so than, like, a professional therapist, it being someone who had that shared experience was, like, so important, and I didn't really connect with, like there are support groups, there's things like that. I didn't find, like, really community in that way there,
Mhm.
but yeah, I wish so I would if you're at, like, the very beginning, I would just be like, try and find, like, a buddy, like, try and find, like, a trusted person who's a little bit ahead of you down the path,
Mhm.
um, and then just, like, save their phone number so that you can
Yeah.
call them. Um,
It's a great piece
yeah,
of advice because
yeah.
I agree. I had the same experience and we just didn't I know some people in talking to people where they connected with somebody in the orientation, for instance, or
Mhm,
throughout the classes, and then they went through the whole thing together, but that wasn't our experience.
mhm,
Our classes weren't really set up like that, and it just didn't happen, and we didn't go out of our way. Yeah, I don't know. We also took a big break in between certifying and then actually doing it. So
mhm.
maybe that also hindered it. But yeah, I totally agree with you. And I wish there was more community. And that is definitely one of the reasons why I'm doing the show. So thank you
Yeah.
for that piece. That's really lovely.
Yeah,
And
'cause every time or I mean, I guess really just anytime, yeah, anytime I do connect with someone who has a shared story, I just, like, I think it's such a valuable, um it feels like such a special and valuable thing to be like, "Oh, like, you have been there too, kind of, or you sort of know what I'm talking about," or all of that, so
it does because it's such a unique experience and people as amazing as your other friends are and everyone else, it's like it's not quite the same. Going through it is just it's a thing. It's like
Yep.
going through war or something. Like how people with their military and they're like, you were in the okay, like, and they get they get each other. It's almost a little bit
Mhm.
like that, not to equate it
Yeah,
or
no, it's
anything, but
you
like, yeah.
can't have that, and it's really not possible, I don't think, to try and, like, share like, it's hard. It's hard to
Right.
try and,
Right.
bridge that to someone who hasn't also been there, had some type of that shared experience, and it's yeah, so I think, the more that the more that I've shared about, like, my experience and things like that, the more that I have actually connected with people who have some type of
Yeah.
overlap or things like that, and that's been super cool, and I've been like, "Oh,
Yep.
cool. I wish that, like, A, I had had that at the outset, but second of all, I wish that, like, now more people can also tap into that and have a little bit of that shared
Right.
community."
Yep, yep. All right. Well, thank you for doing your part in service to that and coming on the show. That was awesome.
Yes, yeah.
We'll say goodbye now, but stick around for a minute and I'll say goodbye to you separately. And
Cool.
thank you so much for being on with us.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
All right.